Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval Flemish tactics, talking effectively about chiefly the communal armies of Flanders between the 14th and the 15th century. We will en passant discuss also the feudal forces of this area that were still consistent and important, sometimes capable of having even several hundreds, if not even thousands altogether, of cavalry at once, even though it's still something relatively rare. So we have discussed, I think, already the medieval organization, Flemish armies during the 11th and 13th century. This is, in a certain sense, the continuation of it, but in a very different time in history, and especially for Flanders, that saw at this point essentially the collapse of the major feudal institutions, right, that had practically already occurred, the rise of importance of this very wealthy and important centers such as Ghent, Brugge, etc., Liège as well, as we will see. There are naturally, and there is this area of Europe that, to second just to Italy, basically produced this important city-states that had effectively a very powerful military that at the beginning of 14th century, however, changed really more than other areas of Europe. Medieval warfare essentially producing, starting from Courtrai/Courtrai, as far as I understand it's pronounced now, basically the first victories after 2 centuries substantially of infantry as a single arm, right, without support of cavalry, in fact against feudal cavalry, right, and not just one among the others, but effectively the flower of European cavalry, that is the French royal princely cavalry. That is really a great turning point in the history of European warfare, because effectively it's the very beginning of a very and extremely long decline of cavalry. It's difficult to frame it in a perspective, because objectively there is nothing theological in this transformation. As you know from other videos, I study exactly this time in history, albeit concentrated on other European regions. And yet, when you look at this important series of tens of victories of essentially Flemish, Scottish, Swiss, English, and Dithmarschen victory over feudal cavalry, first of all, you have to pay very much attention to every single one of these systems, their context, their enemies, because also, feudal cavalry was a bit standard of the time, but there are different polities of different power, but also realizing that by the mid 14th century, fundamentally, this infantry victories stop, right? That is not to say that there is no infantry anymore, that there is no transformation of infantry up to essentially the mid 15th century, when the Swiss come up with something very different from what they had also, been using similarly to other peoples in the first half of the 14th century. And from there, it's the Renaissance warfare that starts. We will actually look at it today with the Battle of Guinegat, how the Flemish actually enter pretty quickly compared to other powers in that way, albeit under the Habsburgic direction, and not with much of a great result at that point, because effectively, the military reform of the Flemish cities failed, and that's how the Landsknecht were invented eventually. But that's another story. That's another age, right? And it's very important, because instead, from Courtrai, it's as if another part of medieval history had died at that point, right? When you look at the fact, Courtrai is known as the Battle of the Golden Spores, right? This mass of golden spores that were stripped from the French knights after the defeat, and that represented the golden spore were the greatest gift at the chivalric tournaments, that they embodied fundamentally the elite of the heavy cavalry. Well, here paraded by the Flemish burghers in their town, and representing the sense, really a world upside down. Like the psychological effect of such battles was at that time shocking, right? Infantry, as we've seen also in other victories in the previous 2 centuries, hadn't been just passively subordinated. There had been, especially in Flanders and in Italy, these episodes in which objectively very sturdy and stubborn infantries had countered somewhat effectively the heavy cavalry before being saved, however, still by their own cavalry, but and that had surely given confidence to the commoners that from the first half of the 14th century would achieve those victories on the field. But at the same time, it's studying a bit more critically this episode, this period, because as far as I know, the greatest works being written here is by De Vries, the infantry warfare in the early 14th century. That is very interesting and thought-provoking, but it's merely a tactical analysis that entails these major battles like Courtrai, Montpellier, that was also, after all, a Flemish victory, but also others in which infantry, failed, like Cassel. And we will see, especially in Flemish warfare of the 14th and 15th century, that a pretty good example of a military system that, albeit achieving this resounding success at the beginning of the 14th century, objectively didn't evolve into something more sophisticated, more robust. Also, if anything, from an institutional point of view, these cities remained essentially different, independent city-states. They didn't form other forms of regional power of military organization, right? They stuck to the model that, after all, had been the regular one of the European commonalities up to that point. And albeit it remains very striking the amount of men that the Flemish were able to put on the field, we'll see that there is also this striking series of defeats at the hands of the French as well, but also the Burgundians, that proved that even though there were transformations along the way, still this the failure infantry, as such, as of armies that were fundamentally based just on it. Because let's be honest, here these were armies of footmen. Doesn't matter how there is a slight increase in cavalry, and especially in firearms over time, the formula remained unvaried. Whereas other European armies fundamentally, evolved in other ways, but especially what you witness from the mid-14th century is a refeudalization of European military culture, right? If you see the 14th and 15th century as a flat let's say as a constant increase of infantry importance, well, that was at least not a linear process, right? There were major setbacks, but especially that thing does not evolve until you see a different type of political and social before the military organization, right? It's not a surprise that the military renaissance began in a place like Switzerland, that was at that point essentially working as a single country in spite of the division of its contents into its various communities that put on the plate really a major amount of resources of a compact country that was also fairly populous at the time, whereas other very sophisticated armies like the Burgundian one or the Venetian one, they definitely had pretty damn good military in many ways, and they're also, especially the Burgundians, misportrayed, considering the failure against the Swiss by certain standards. We have to go a bit more in detail and that, because you see that there were also other factors. It's not that the Swiss tactical model was undefeatable by itself. It was always the winning one. It was the future in the sense that it was understood by European states at that point were forming as such towards a modern horizon, at least how we see it as ex post, that when you have that a highly professionally trained army of thousands is definitely something you can do a lot more things from a tactical point of view than you can do just with patching together of feudal and communal militias that that have no common collective training out of their entourage, and they are largely essentially depending more on this, not just on brute force, but at least on tactics that are fairly simple, and on armies that are, albeit effective in their own context, still coming from a less organized and also logistically supplied, for example, system that needs something more to really take the thing to the next step. And I say all this because historiographically speaking, battles like Courtrai have been rightfully, highlighted as a moment of great importance. But the more you contextualize them in the whole trail of military developments in here, the more you get aware that we have a bit of bias looking at the thing, because we look in these victories as a victory of a more democratic society, for example, of the commoners, right, against the feudal, the ancien regime, right. It was yet to be crystallized at this point, telling the truth, and that also the city oligarchies in certain cases backed, and therefore we express this sympathy as if. But from a strictly military point of view, what is important to highlight here is the moral forces involved, as always, right? And I think that the Flemish military, in this sense, represent the best example of this, because these were people literally devoid of any military preparation. I mean, the commoners that won of Courtrai had never taken an arm in their hands before, but they managed to defeat basically the best troops that Europe could field. In open field, right, relative open field. As we will see now, there were ditches and other protections in there in the battlefield, but that's not important. It's still an enormous deal that reflects the great expansion of these communities in Flanders, of these very rich and independent-minded cities that also maintained this attitude essentially as a constitutive part of their historical, political, national identity, right? Even under the Burgundians that will effectively defeat them and annex them to their territories. But however, Flanders acquired this, even some sort of, in the process of administrative uniformation, also set of, a sort of proto-national identity that for the time is a big deal. And these are the same lands that will secede effectively historically from the Holy Roman Empire, creating something on their own. The United Provinces in a few centuries would become, as you know, the graveyard of Spain in some way, of the Spanish Empire. They will have major, also military developments at sea, but also on land, in ways that were much more tied to their, especially the good employment of their economical resources, for example, right? The Dutch army between the let's say the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century is in military history in absolute the most effective relatively to economical cost, right? And this is, so if you look at it statistically speaking, these guys knew what we were investing in, and not because they were, military geniuses, but because they were good politicians, and their society also essentially hiring mercenaries, right? There is all deep cultural implications in here that sometimes also betray certain concepts that we have developed, especially from Romanticism onwards, such as there are pure idiocies, like that mercenaries are less faithful than, subjects, for example. It's completely false. I mean, study medieval warfare and see what's the deal. So, in my opinion, it's healthier. And I tell you these things because I also came from that mindset in some sense. I mean, not this last one about romanticism. I never bought that, but the concept that this early 14th century effectively brought to such a radical change in medieval warfare. Whereas even if you look at this thing from a geographical point of view, after all, there were a few communities, right? Sometimes also very different from the others. I mean, there is a big deal of difference between, the Flanders, for example, some of the richest lands of Europe, and Scotland was fairly depressed, or the Ditmarsh, right? That was even worse. Switzerland was a sort of halfway at that point. So England was an exception. And the exception was it developed its tactics from from the mindset of a king, not from the will of a people, for example, which is very different from what happens in the Flanders, where they didn't have a king, but they had a people that brought those victories. So these things, in my opinion, must be, historiographically speaking, still to be addressed correctly. We should explain how what we see here is mostly a moral awakening of certain communities that had now grown sufficiently and had enough military programs to look at elsewhere in Europe to say, okay, you know what, even as commoners, we can break free from this moral and psychological inferiority and subordination to feudalism, to the feudal elite, and we can do something on our own. And the Flemish were, in my opinion, those who probably demonstrated it better, right? You can see some of the greatest victories you can find were also at the hands here, for example, mercenary companies like the Catalans, that in this sense were not a people, but rather a mercenary company. If you look at the Battle of Kyphistos, for example, it's an astonishing victory, some of the greatest. But here in Flanders, you see something very different. It is literally these commoners going, face to face, with muscle to muscle with French heavy cavalry. I mean, I would like to stress for a moment the brutality of this concept. I don't know if you have ever thought what it means to deal with a cavalry charge. As we have stressed in Schwerpunkt here, and we will see it better, it's not just it's not a matter of weapons, right? Don't talk about the Guinegat, that even we'll see how terminologically speaking that's not even correct. Which better the Kyphistos stuff, I believe it's pronounced, than the Guinegat, that also is a pretty obscure weapon about which we know very few. Here it's all the courage, the determination of these people, right? You don't stop French cavalry just because you have all these many people that, by the way, at Courtrai, there weren't even so many compared to other armies. The Flemish were able to field of footmen. At Courtrai there were something like between 8,000 10,500 men, right? So it was not a lot. The French actually were more than them. They had 50,000 men, including 2,500 cavalry. Then eventually, now we can't enter in the details of the sources, but here we're talking about moral qualities involved, right? This is the thing that strikes you here, that these Flemish armies do not have a military sophistication. If you take other infantry tactics, like the one the Italians were using, for example, those things were pretty damn advanced. They were based on a deep coordination of all the various elements. There were large bodies of specialistic troops involved. They were exploiting combined tactics at their best. Here you have just a tide of footmen that just really take in French cavalry charges. And that's one of the literally most devastating things that you can ever even think of, right? With things like deep traumas like you can have from shelling. It's not things that began with World War I, right? Always the example I make is that when they made the movie Waterloo in the 70s, there was a cooperation, by the way, between Western Bloc countries and the Soviet Union in part, that in fact most of the soldiers you see in the scenes are effectively Red Army troops. I mean, those were people that, there were people among them that had literally fought against Nazi panzers barehanded, right, assaulting them, like that in World War II. Well, you couldn't keep these people steady and firm in front of a fake cavalry charge, the one you see when the French charged the British square, because these people were scared, right? People, I repeat it, that had gone against German tanks on the Eastern Front face to face couldn't hold their ground in front of hundreds of cavalry charging at them, because that's literally the devastating shock that cavalry, aside from any physical impact that it can have, that is also devastating, is overwhelmingly superior in this sense, and disruptive, destructive against the human psyche. Like, you must have an enormous determination to face a cavalry charge, and this is what the Flemish had, right? They preferred to die than to be unfree. And that's how you win a battle, right? It's not about the good and dog, right? It's not about complicated tactical sophistication and geniuses. These people didn't have a military culture. These people were commoners. They were shopkeepers. They didn't give a damn about war in itself. And they won against French cavalry that were literally the single most professional troops of the entire European warfare you could ever find anywhere. I mean, there is nobody like them who spent a lifetime to be a true military man in the core sense of the word. And once again, there is this enormous, crushing weight of moral inferiority. Like, you have no idea what it means to feel constantly there is someone at the top of you that is superior to you, then crushes you, and you have to work for. Right? The French cavalry, as all the nobility in Europe, thought that the peasantry, the commoners, were on foot at that point, were subhuman beings. I mean, they didn't consider them to be humans like them. They considered them to be something between humans and animals, right? And there was it was a good thing to oppress them, to massacre them. Like, was no interest in them whatsoever, right? Just a shout to nationalisms. These people didn't give a damn whether a peasant was French or whatever. These people were inferiors, point. They could die. They didn't give a damn about them. It was perfectly normal in their mindset, in their view, right? Yet, another thing that will have to observe better is that I try to bring constantly on the fore, especially when I talk about the 100 Years' War, but also in this context in here, that we too often stereotype the feudal cavalry as brainless morons who believed by default that they were the best in combat, and that therefore they didn't have to care about, the English tactics, famous tactics of the 100 Years' War, or about even angry peasants. This is absolutely false for anyone who has even a minimal knowledge of, feudal military culture, right? Every cavalryman has always known, even at the peak of feudalism, that an angry mob of peasants could be very, very, very dangerous. And this idea that infantry was so inferiorized that the nobility was blind to their potential military capacities is also wrong. And also, if you study these battles in general, you, aside from the massive historical difficulty in their reconstruction, you always realize that usually, the feudal side was very solidly competent. I mean, the meaning that these people, the idea that these people would simply throw their lives away because they didn't they didn't give a damn about infantry is nonsense. I mean, it has no historical basis. It's demonstrated to be wrong by the same behavior that these troops had on the field. But unfortunately, and I'm discovering it right just in these years, that there is still a historiographical massive historiographical bias and obsession towards the achievements of infantry between the 14th and 15th century, partly because it's been paraded chiefly by certain national historiographers that had to stress, oh, look at our infantries, we were good because we were the people, right? We were the same people we are today because we are cool, wink wink, right? And that's the general attitude. Secondly, also because there is not a compared diachronic studying of these periods. Like, it's objectively difficult to find people who were competent, for example, silly, but not so silly, detail. Who is competent in the various vernaculars of these countries, like in studying the sources in a proper sense with a careful, thoughtful preparation. I mean, there is the idea that there is even a structuralist approach sometimes to these transformations, a teleological view of this idea that infantry had to develop necessarily, was heading towards. There's a very simplistic and naive approach to medieval warfare in general, in my opinion, and also it rests on essentially a modernistic vision of warfare, right? The late medieval warfare especially is often read to look at the main titles. The greatest scholars have written about this in the key of a progress that would head towards the Renaissance, right? And we can't hide that, of course, what is happening here would build what also the Renaissance would be based on. But once again, was a very gradual and still a very, also pondered. Like, I don't know how to say this, but the concept is that the people at the time still were very aware of what was going on. After all, they couldn't foresee what would happen more than much, but still we're not talking about a strange Hegelian force that was passing through now Europe, bringing to the development of such military systems, right? It was a very gradual and also, in fact, even dramatic. There were lots of setbacks, of failures, right? And that's also what Flemish warfare presents quite clearly here. I mean, these guys achieved Courtrai, that is possibly, in fact, the greatest infantry victory of the world Middle Ages, especially considering in the, say, feudal context of Europe at the time. And in the rest of their in these 2 centuries, they objectively don't accomplish a great much. And there's not an institutionally military character to these communities. They remained essentially largely what had always been, and happy of being so, because they largely enjoyed their own autonomies, even their own freedoms. But once again, we have to also look at the surroundings in many ways, and realizing that albeit there were definitely great achievements and successes, thinking once again about the English armies, but still there is not a absolute value to measure, what was happening in France at that time, and not looking what was happening in Germany or in Spain, or somewhere else, right? Because it's always a matter of context after all. So there is not a winning tactic that always wins. There is not a technologistic take on things like, that the English won because of their longbow, right? And all the others were fundamentally stupid that they didn't use it, or maybe even if they used them, like it happened with Burgundy, etc. But, there were also other peoples that kept using their own good crossbows, and they were perfectly fine with that, after all. So once again, we need to stay open when looking at this period in history and realizing that there is not just one area. Like, there is a dramatic emphasis and concentration, especially on the 100 Years' War and its surroundings, I think, especially for the 15th century. And that's what has become popularly iconic, and the rest is all read through that filter. Look on the internet. Just make a simple question about the tactics of the 100 Years' War, and it's it doesn't, they never contextualize the thing outside of it, at a European scale, for example. See what was happening elsewhere, right? But aside from this, I think that the Flemish, and this is also not to say, I would like to stress this quite importantly, that even if doesn't emerge such an enormously flattering picture of, military successes of Flanders, still in these centuries after the first wave of the early 14th century, well, you see that still there is, you must evaluate these armies in their political and social context. And in their ways, they also definitely achieved certain results that are important and very interesting to observe, because they explain a lot also about Flemish culture and how these communities were developing. So if we were to talk about tactics, strictly speaking, to make a very concise synthesis of what we're talking about in here, we have to distinguish, as we said at the beginning, between the feudal Low Countries and the communal armies, right, of Flanders especially. Once again, the Low Countries, generally speaking, are in feudal Europe, right? And even if there's been a crisis, especially in the County of Flanders, of feudal institutions in the previous centuries, there are still important feudal polities, and their military is definitely important, right? And these battle formations and tactics of lowland feudal troops were fundamentally identical to those of their French neighbors, right? We have to give it. They were essentially emerging from archaically speaking Frankish military culture, right? If you look at this wide area of Central Europe between France and Germany, well, that was the standard, right? There were certain isles also deep and deeply rooted feudal military culture, right? Albeit it's fascinating to see, and today we're really being brutally concise in here, because these things should be observed step by step, but we'll have to do it looking eventually at one battle per video at some point. But we'll see that also the lowlander feudal troops were influenced in part by, let's say, English tactics, or however what was going on at large in the 100 Years' War, right? Even among the French, because as we have seen, they were essentially behaving like there wasn't much of a difference. For example, the lowland feudal troops fielded in alliance with Edward III in 1339, albeit behaving like French as we have observed, they still dismounted with the rest of Edward's army. And, quote, they put all their horses and baggage into a little wood behind them and fortified it. We will see how communal armies of Flanders would do essentially the same thing on several occasions. There are certain similarities in this regard. There is still something that is shared, in spite of the very different political and military background between the English armies and the Flemish armies at this point. Essentially in their defensive array, right? So this idea of dismounting, as Flemish troops mostly fought on foot, right, by the foe, so not even the need to dismount, but in this case, even feudal troops fortified essentially their baggage, right, as a sort of this happens many times. We will have seen it also with the Burgundian army when we have discussed it in detail. It was normal to create this last resort, or to revert in case of breaking of the main formation, and where they could put up a last stand, but also as a field fortification, because as we will see, especially the Flemish communal armies were quite vulnerable to rare attacks, and they would in fact also suffer important defeats in spite of also the camp fortifications at their back. But today I would like to concentrate, in fact, as we were saying before, imminently on the communal infantry, and the tactics of communal infantry, as they are objectively peculiar. Like, there is no other country in Europe that fields as many infantry, and only infantry, like the Flemish at this point in history. In another video we will see better what was the actual composition of these armies. I mean, the army organization as a whole, right? And what we see synthesizing now is this solid amount of commoners fighting on foot, coming from the guilds or this, city levies, variously organized, and then a few cavalry. Actually, the same Flemish cities will produce an increasing amount of cavalry in the centuries on their own. These were the richest merchants, right? As whoever had enough wealth to serve on horseback was called to do it, but still the overwhelming majority of the troops was on foot. Then also other types of specialists, especially crossbowmen, were developed similarly to what the Italians were doing. There were also bands of desperates, right, that worked more as mercenaries, professional troops, right, but there were smaller bands like the White Hose, they were called, and they were ferocious. They lived. They were very similar to the Brabançons, in fact, that we have discussed in some other video, that ravaged France in the 12th century. I mean, this band of mountaineers that lived effectively as sacking and pillaging and fighting in order to achieve that in the first place, but they were a bit like, if not outcasts, but still definitely something very different from the average Flemish commoner living in safely in its city walls, and also making money in a more honest way, I would say. But it's this that really strikes you. I mean, that the basic lowland battle formation was the phalanx, right? What we can call the phalanx, generally speaking, right? The phalanx now everybody associates it chiefly by assonance to pikemen, chiefly trained in a somewhat intensive way, etc. But even if you look at the original Greek term, phalanx is basically a term applied even to Celtic armies. Like, even you didn't have to have a massive collective discipline. It was just the bulk of infantrymen, right? Of this heavy infantry, objectively. It's very interesting to look at Italian sources of, especially of the early 14th century, when it was recognized to these armies that Flanders were, because there were lots of Italian merchants there in Flanders, as you know, as they were making freaking lot of money with England and those places. So they knew pretty well what was going on there. In fact, some of the best sources from even the war between France and Flanders at this point were coming from people like Villani, for example. And one thing that strikes you there is that the Italians saw themselves in a very particular way. Their warfare was somewhat even, painted as surprising for the same Flemish. Like, exactly in these times of great infantry development in Flanders, still there were this foreign foot mercenaries in employment of the French king sent in Flanders after Courtrai, etc., that seemingly proved to be something very different from what the lowlanders were this time, right? Because these lowlanders are, as we've seen, commoners, right? They're masses of non-professional troopers from other areas of Europe where there had been an earlier, more intense infantry development, like Italy. You see this Lombard and Tuscan professional pikemen that could be hired by contractors in Italy by the French, and that at that point are something very, very fascinating to compare. And what the Italians see in the Flemish is chiefly, as far as I understand, this solid, aside from their courage and bravery, and the Italians recognize strikingly the exaltation that the Flemish have, like this idea that they had managed, that they were crazed to have won the French on the field. They were even somewhat overconfident. We will see it better with Montpellier and Cassel were effectively paid pretty dearly for that. But the fact they were also materially wealthy, they had pretty damn good armor in general. They were as wealthy burghers, they had this stocks of armor, and they were generally heavily armored. And this is also quite interesting. And I don't know how true this is. Like, I don't know whether we can talk about Flemish infantry this time also having a lot to do in its effectiveness, also with the sheer wealth that these cities could have by themselves, right? Because elsewhere the situation is quite different. The Ditmarscher are dramatically poor, right? And they managed to defeat the Counts of Holstein, for example, with just their other different capabilities, like especially exploiting terrain pretty cleverly. The Flemish now are confident also because they evidently see themselves as as they have to protect a real material. Well, it's not just about their survival or their freedom as simple human freedom. These people are freaking wealthy. I mean, the lowlands now, especially Flanders, of course, are booming. So they have a massive economical interest involved, and they also probably invested in their equipment pretty damn well. So that maybe that also had to do with part in their resistance, right? Albeit, we will have to dig in this more intensively. But in here, as we often say, it's not about the weapon that you use, right? We should talk at this point also about the rest of the equipment, such as the famous Godendag, right? Is it the Gepindestave or the Godendag? Because we don't know much about the Godendag after all, right? It becomes a bit the national symbol of the Flemish revolt. But we don't have actually integral samples, right? We have just fragments on which there is also a bit of debate. And the same name Godendag, but also Godendags or Godendag, has an uncertain origin in itself, right? It probably effectively means good day, good morning, right? Godendag, right? As in German, Guten Tag. But which is also what Villani, for example, explains the name like. Others have instead suggested that it could mean good daga. So good dag, right, in the local language. But whatever this is, the point is that the French, for example, behaved in the latter etymology, right, while the Flemish themselves at the time, this is what a few people know, called it the Gepindestave, that is simply a pointy stick. And sometimes these weapons are not even classified because objectively they're so underdocumented that even apologists tend to exclude them from their catalogs, right? And definitely the most famous representation is of a Godendag is the Oxford chest, right? Which is a wooden box with historical figures on it that depict the scenes of the Battle of Courtrai, right? Which portray somewhat the most iconographic type of soldier equipped with a Godendag. So it's essentially a mace. It looks like a mace that culminates with this metallic reinforcement surmounted by a top, right, a pointy top. Therefore, this is a weapon that is good both at blunt, traumatic offense, but also of piercing with the tip. At the chapel of the Saints John and Paul at Ghent are also preserved certain paintings that show other types of Godendag, right, that are less massive than the ones represented on the Oxford chest, and that are actually used by the archers of the militia of Ghent, right? And therefore, the militia of Ghent appears equipped with pikes, naturally, and with other weapons that are very similar to the Guinegat, but are longer, right? And there's a detail that helps to, frame the Guinegat better also among the other pole arms, because there are other weapons called the candelabras, right, that are actually a pretty widespread weapon between the 14th and 16th century. Maybe not widespread, but still fairly common. And that has been found even in Flanders. And these are, somewhat similar to the ones. They have this lower flat bases under the tip, right, that is typical of the candelabras. And the sleeve, which together with the tank connects the tip to the wood, right? And the plate that is solid and thick increases the fracturing action of the weapon when you slash against, and which also must have had a handle no longer than about 1.5 meters and a section sufficient to withstand blows. In this sense, showed by the previous sources are provided with this plate, what the others largely don't. So the Guinegat was an effective weapon, but probably was too heavy to be effective. Like the trauma weapons had normally this oval or rectangular section was aligned with the cut of the weapon, while in this case the circle section brings an excessive weight, right, overall. So on the other hand, it had to be somewhat useful easy to use after all, because, and also to build, by the way, because it didn't have just one version from the side of which you had to handle it, right? So yeah, and there are other sources in which you see that the candlestick, the candelabra, whatever you want to call it, is shorter even than axes, for example, or falchions, right? So it's fairly well handy, right? And it could be a junction between the candlestick and the Guinegat, but they're definitely not as an anti-cavalry weapon by itself. So the ways actually we think, internally speaking, the first ranks, especially of the Flemish phalanx, could be articulated, could be like a front line made of pikemen, then a second one of shorter pole arms, and the third ones with, blunt weapons and swords, right? And the idea is that there is not much else these guys have to do at the beginning of the early 14th century but defending, because the pike here is stationary, so that you just have to absorb the hit, and not even in that case we were sure that it was effective, right? Because we know French cavalry actually entering the enemy lines, managing to pierce through at some point. So even if the first ranks had been equipped with a pike, and then the others immediately with shorter pole arms, and the guys in the rear with other blunt weapons, swords to engage, who entered in, still we know that these victories of the Flemish infantries were obtained with massive difficulties, right? That at Courtrai, the French, as in fact, entered the Flemish formation, and a few hundreds men actually died, which normally, if you look at how battles were fought at the time, there was a pretty good feat, good achievement. Like, the French had been fairly disorganized since they had crossed the ditch that occasion, etc. But the idea is still that we know from chronicles that what happened in the first lines of Flemish phalanx was hell, right? It wasn't the French just impaling themselves on the pikes, right? They entered in and started fighting like hell, and these guys fought back like hell in the same way. And the general idea, especially when you look at Courtrai, is that that the greatest strength of this phalanx, once again, was its determination, right? There wasn't any specific. Of course, it was a compact mass. It was deployed well, right, cleverly, with especially this L-shaped disposition along the channels, along the streams, and with reserves, and say with this different angles that could cover in part even flank attacks, but it's still a very passive idea. It's simply staying there, taking the cavalry charge, and that's how it happened, and that's why Courtrai is legitimately remembered as the most exemplar proof of an infantry that simply by standing against cavalry manages to win. But on the other hand, you see that this battle was won at also at somewhat important cost, right? Even some commanders died effectively in this battle, and was a great struggle, right? So this does not work well with mechanicistic explanation. Oh, I used that combination of troops equipped with those weapons in the first ranks, and therefore these guys were butchered. Right? No. In my view, it was not even properly an innovation to court. Right? We should understand better, actually, when certain weapons developed, how they were decided to be employed in that way. And in general, still, it's not about the formation itself that is deep, also to absorb the attack. So it has this intrinsic awareness about what it's gonna meet, right? Is tending to pierce through, and yes, definitely knights charged into the pikes, right? It did happen, right? It wasn't that the pikemen by themselves are the answer. So that for you just takes to have those weapons to keep cavalry away. You must stand there, and you must absorb still the cavalrymen that are gonna break through in a way or another. And if you don't have enough solid resistance, as we will see also in other battles here later on, you're done for. You can easily smash a phalanx of spearmen or even of pikemen just by charging it through it. Yes, it did happen. Now we will see when in the late 14th century. Now I must say, in general, also comparing this infantry revival in the early 14th centuries, that even in other areas of Europe where infantry had start rising, the trends are pretty similar. Like, there is a beginning which, after all, the phalanx is not so numerous. Like, if you look at the numbers of the Flemish infantry at Courtrai, they're fairly contained compared to other numbers later on, right? There is this idea that even infantry was probably emerging in that regard from a background in which there were smaller bodies of troops that were more determined, more cohesive, more solidly conceived from a tactical point of view, that eventually called for others, for numbers to increase, but also the quality to decrease. And that's in a nutshell the history of Flanders as well in this period, right? As we've seen, another clever thing that was done by all armies, not just by the ones of footmen, is that wherever possible the phalanx would secure its flanks on the unnatural obstacles, right? We have seen the ditches at Courtrai. They were also artificially built, right, aside from the channels that existed there. Also a hedge and a brook at Monon-Pevel. This is normal. This is what feudal armies did all the time, right? And it's obvious that, and that will keep doing, right? Because that's not an advantage intrinsic for infantry. That is functional for every single army. And as we've seen, in general, Flemish tactics tended to be defensive in nature, right? By vocation. The same Flemish commoners knew, aside from their, heated up spirits, that sometimes would make them, change idea on what they had to do on the field, that these armies were not conceived for an aggressive character, right? And this actually speaks for the general level of morale of Flemish infantry that was on average pretty high. All right, you find this sometimes reckless decision of abandoning advantageous defensive positions that would have made him won the day for various reasons that were almost invariably the cause of their defeat. So this is very interesting, because when you compare these infantries with what would come later with the Swiss model, you understand how different they were. Like, the greatest problem in here was maintaining cohesion during the advance, right? It's not that these armies cannot advance for some reason, but they're clever enough to understand that if they do it, they will lose cohesion, they will lose the battle order, and therefore they will be easily overwhelmed, and they would also recur, in fact, to certain tricks, apparently, chiefly, even in defense, right? Because a great deal of these formations is that the problem with untrained militia is that they may lose formation even in defense, right? It's not either. These are not. They are meant to be static formations, but cavalry had dominated European battlefields. It will keep doing it effectively, largely for most of the 14th and 15th century, because it could easily break. Everybody, will pose themselves in front of them. So what's the deal? Right? That don't fall even in here in the trap of thinking, it just takes a bunch of infantry that is well placed, and stationary, and then you will defeat cavalry. Well, for 200 years it didn't happen. If it didn't happen, it's not because people had forgotten that they could use infantrymen against cavalry, but once again, because they were morally inferior. They didn't have the guts to do it, because effectively, cavalry at some point was pretty damn, the product was pretty damn wealthy and powerful and determined and skilled political and social system, whereas the middle classes, the lower classes, were too weak, right? It's not a coincidence that this turn takes place at the beginning of the 14th century. That's the last spurt of the great medieval civilization of 14th century crisis, right? That was an entirely different world also from what would develop in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, that in fact are pretty interestingly characterized by regression of infantry, right? More than an improvement, because if you look once again at the achievements of infantry in these 2 centuries, before the mid of 14th century, the wave, the tide of the growth of popular classes of the previous centuries, then that stops. And in order to have something functional again as infantry on the battlefield, you need entire countries like Switzerland that decide to put an enormous amount of resources to train professional troops. That is something that these guys at the beginning of the 14th century weren't by the slightest, right? So this is crucial to understand. Don't see 14th and 15th century again as the rise of infantry by some magical push. It wasn't effectively like that, and still there are other factors that are taking place now, like the spread of firearms that also contemplated other ways also of using infantry, as firearms here, chiefly artillery, are a different arm from infantry, and it's used in a different way. So even in here, if cavalry power is slightly reduced, it's not entirely because of infantry strength, right? So tactics also tended to produce this increased field fortification. Like, there was a stalemate at one point brought by these infantries that had reached a certain level of development, but once again they stopped there. In certain cases they even regressed, whereas the general wealth of these communities continued in some cases to make them afford enough resources to build field fortifications that could fill the gap between the cavalry strength and infantry cohesion could actually prevent infantry from spending itself so much in front of cavalries when they could simply hide behind a fortification. That's also what probably brought to there is here the cause effect relation can be switched at all times, but even that's why certain weapons were improved at that point, such as crossbow, also the importance of the longbow, as we know, but artillery itself. So it's typical actually of the late Middle Ages to see battlefields always more fortified. Generally speaking, also troops to be always heavier in some way, right? You know that the 15th century especially is the moment in which you could have seen more metal armor around, spread even among common troops, right? This passed chiefly through also the gradual centralization of certain powers that could pay for a more uniform equipment. But sometimes it's also, as we've seen before, these more, let's say, democratic communities like city-states, etc., that could afford individually, as citizens, their own equipment, right? Even if there is always a kind of sort of collective organization, supply systems, etc. Field fortifications were thrown up, for example, at Rozenbeek, I believe it's pronounced like this, where the Flemish dug a great large dike to the front. Otherwise, the phalanx might be drawn up behind a natural defensible position, such as the same ditches at Courtrai. Either way, the lowland troops tended to have considerable faith in their solidity of their array altogether. Right, this is typical also of Flanders, but to the point of rarely holding back any kind of reserve. This is also very interesting. Usually, these armies weren't segmented. Right, there could be sometimes there actually were reserves, but the idea is that the phalanx was just one block. There weren't several layers, as you can find in other armies at this point. And that also speaks for, probably political reasons, but also for the effective lack of military sophistication and collective training. The idea is that you have this solid bulk of infantry homogeneously deployed on a single line, a single rank, and that's it, right? You have to break through, and it's not easy, right? It's also considered this fact that even when cavalry is still superior to these blocks, these are to be feared, because naturally cavalry wasn't pretty happy to have to charge in them, especially when you had these masses of pikes that could be murderously effective, right? So, as we were saying before, cavalry is always pretty damned well aware what infantry was capable of doing. But the main problem also of these units, these armies, as we've seen before, is that they are relatively unwieldy, right? They can't perform complicated maneuvers. They don't have the level of training for them, right? And that's what instead other armies will experiment in this day, the ones of Burgundy, but also more effectively the Swiss ones later on in the 15th century. But still, the Burgundians will prove, for example, their tactical flexibility against the lowlanders. A consequence of the lack of reserves also meant that the lowland armies needed to be particularly sure not only of their flanks, but also that their backs were well protected, since one of the surest ways of defeating not just their phalanx, but actually any army at that point, was to attack it in the flank and rear with cavalry, right? So, as we've seen at Courtrai, there was this L-shaped formation that somewhat protected also part of the flank but we can think at Montpellier and Autey. We will see later better which the Flemish used their baggage wagons to protect their rear, right? While their initial position at Rosebecke had a belt of trees and broom behind it. So if the situation degenerated with an attack in the rear during the battle, the phalanx would draw up emergentially, and also I don't know with how much effectiveness at some point, in the manner of a crown, like a bit like the Scottish children, just to make you understand a bit what we're talking about, with this defensive circle bristling with pikes, right, as they did at Cassel. But at Cassel, as we will see, the situation would go pretty bad for them, because actually they were surrounded by the French. They were fighting to the death. At one point the French even let them a gap in their formation open to flee so that they could butcher them better. And that's also a pretty interesting memento to the mechanicist and positivistic fans that pretend, if you use the schiltrum you can't fence off cavalry. Well, at Cassel the Flemish did, and were butchered down to the last, right? So once again, moral forces, and not just those, are needed to prevail. And as we were saying before, most of the Flemish defeats actually seem to have resulted from ill-advisedly taking the offensive. And there's an astonishing list of these situations: Montpellier, Cassel, Rosebecke, Rupelmonde, and Gavere. Froissart, talking about the Battle of Rosebecke, provides us with quite interesting information about lowland tactics. He describes how they came on at a good pace, all close together, their pikes all held straight up on high, and there were so many of them they had the appearance of a wood. And once engaged, they sat on proudly, thrusting with their pikes and shoulders like wild boars, and they held themselves so close together that they could not be broken into. Before the battle, the Flemish commander Philip van Artevelde had advised his captains to, quote, "Beware that we do not open up our ranks. Let each man bear his pike straight before him, and interlace your arms, so that none may enter in among you. And let us go at a good pace, and turn neither to left nor right, and shoot our guns all at once, and shoot with our crossbows, and thus shall we dismay our enemies." Now this is very interesting for many reasons. The first one is this appearance that we have seen about this sort of wood of pikes, right? But what especially this idea of this almost othismos, right, of the pikes and shoulders thrust, for which the pikes are used to poke the enemy, and there is still this push from the posterior ranks, like that makes the Flemish similar to wild boars, right? So the idea that there is, after all, a quite strong moral force behind this. I mean, the idea that they really want to aggress, right? They aren't simple passive fighters. They're hot-tempered. That is also a problem of the troops, that the less discipline they have, and they actually, the more they will charge at the wrong moment, right? They will attack at the wrong moment. This is actually pretty true. Like, never think that non-military men are less hot-blooded, right? Actually, some of the most wildly violent and cruel and evil, let's be honest, elements of this society was the people. Like, the people is really ultra-violent. Like the knights by themselves also, they are merciless in many ways. They butcher down people, quite without blinking an eye, but they still have all an awareness of the logic of, energy management, and how they They can freak out too, by the way, because everybody does. Even the most highly trained professional at one point will start using his assault rifle as a club, like the primitive ape that we are effectively. But what I mean here is that the people sometimes makes pretty damn stupid choices. So this need to, for example, abandon the defensive position that could give you the victory simply over and over again, sometimes even in battles that had happened just the year before in the same way, shows that these masses weren't that disciplined after all, and that is dramatically difficult to maintain tens of thousands of poorly trained militia cohese in combat in the first place and obedient, right? So in this order, in fact, of holding themselves close together so that nobody could be broken into, that's very important, right? And this is not really about the idea of how much space there is between a trooper and another. This is really about the risk of the entire front splitting up into different streams, like that detach each other and lose cohesion, and the whole army collapses. And these phrases from Philip van Artevelde are quite meaningful. It says, beware that we do not open our ranks, right? Not that the enemy opens it, but we do not open our own ranks, right? And this idea that let each man bear his pike straight before him and interlace your arms so that none may enter in among you is quite bright. Like the idea, you don't have to put down your pike to pass to some other weapon to do something different, and also interlock your arms, right? That's a good tip, but it's also a desperate one in the sense that a trained soldier doesn't need to interlace his arm with the guys at his side to maintain formation, because those people are trained enough to do that, right? At this point it's difficult to find infantry like that, but I don't know, these mounted men-at-arms were surely capable of it their own way. It's just that most of the times they were more effectively mounted, right? That's also what much of battles, like even Azincourt, should be understood like those guys would have preferably fought on horseback, right? But they were so inferior in number, and that it was wiser for a sheer reason of forces to dismount, so to acquire much greater defensive potential in that way. This reveals pretty clearly a very fascinating trait of Flemish warfare at this point is that there is still an intertwining of feudal and communal culture after all, because if you look at the Flemish military history, especially at the beginning of 14th century, but also the rest of this period, you see that these great victories like Courtrai, for example, were actually due to the fact that certain noblemen had had mingled into the commoners and had told them what to do, right? At Courtrai, it was noblemen, not commoners, who decided what the array would have been, largely, and how they had to fight. And they also dismounted to fight in the front line alongside with them. This is very fascinating, where certain northeastern French noblemen, for example, that were settled in the kingdom of Naples at the time under the Angevins, that came back to their homeland in these regions, also in Flanders, and they were noblemen, like they were feudal lords, but they came back to their native towns to support these communities, right? Even in open break with the French king, because the Angevins were allied with the French, were technically the same actually dynasty, and so that there's always the military professional in here that puts at the communal service his military expertise. That is definitely striking if you consider even the actual competence that these these commanders displayed, and to which the same communal armies owed much. Always remember in this regard that the so-called revolutions never start from the bottom, right? It's not the fury of the people that brings to something, because the fury of the people brings always to defeat. Look at what happened to the peasantry in the same centuries. who really makes the revolution is the guy who's better off and knows already what he can gain from it, and manages to channel this brutal primordial forces of the people in a more or less intelligent, at least orderly way, right? At least enough for achieving certain victories like Autey, and what a hell of a victory that was, right? So what Philip van Artevelde says here is quite meaningful. And the other interesting thing is definitely the mention about of artillery and crossbows. Crossbows were present in here pretty standardly. I mean, there were a minor presence of the Flemish armies altogether, like they were actually effectively in any other army at the time, except for the English that made this overwhelming quantitative use of longbowmen. Like, never forget, longbowmen, in order to be effective, they had in the range of thousands, wildly superior numbers to the men-at-arms to do something, right? Never think even in there that it's the longbow in itself that makes the work. You need a combined tactic and a lot of things put together to make the thing work. But yeah, crossbows are regularly employed, and you find a courtrai that they were used to skirmish with the French one in the front line before revealing the phalanx, right, and retreating. So troops like these for disturbance had always existed, ever to soften up the ranks. But what here is very interesting is rather the artillery reference. As we will see now, in several battles, the communal armies of the Low Countries made considerable use both of light field pieces and handguns, right? Not always with success. Actually, some of the greatest defeats of the Flemish at this point didn't, displayed actually this firepower success that, however, was not enough to win the battle in the first place. But that's a very interesting aspect of it. For example, Monstrelet, by describing the Battle of Rupelmonde in 1452, he noticed that the men of Ghent made good use of their culverines, that they could not withstand the arrows, that however the Flemish could not withstand the arrows of the Picards, and turning about fled. This is very interesting because the Burgundians also were fundamentally employing with success the longbow. Sometimes they were still in the same English longbowmen, right? And in here, still artillery on the field is not what makes the difference. You have to wait the early 16th century in order to find artillery really managing to disrupt decisively the infantry formations, like it happened at Marignano to the Swiss, for example. That had remained, this is important to stress, a mono-arm army, right? Just like the Flemish in here. Like the Swiss had some firepower, crossbowmen, but as we all know, it was fairly influent. Like the first who began to make a organic, tactically effective use of firepower and pikes were the Spanish at their full potential at the beginning of the 16th century. That is important because that also shows you that, yes, the Swiss path opener of Renaissance warfare, but they also the first to decline, right? For the Spanish, then eventually to the Dutch, partly actually, but especially to the Swedes later. But that's not the point. The point is the concept that there is not there's not such a great tactical pride, after all, to be a minimalist society that tends to save too much money for success. Like, look at the Italians during the wars of Italy. I mean, they had some of the pretty damn most sophisticated military systems of the time, and that's a pretty good example, because some say that even if they weren't united, they might have achieved a great deal with their military system they had they at least gone for a while along sort of similar lines. But they didn't want to spend. That was the point. They didn't want to invest. They were essentially mercantile republics in their mindset still at the deepest. They weren't like a French monarchy. It was born with a military mindset since the very beginning. The idea was saving as much money as you could, and much can be said in comparison to the same Flemish that had pretty damn good resources. Now we'll see, especially about artillery, but they didn't develop a professional military system that could consistently expand like in an aggressive sense, because simply their politics wouldn't allow that, right? They were different cities. They had fought pretty hard to obtain their autonomies, and they simply wanted to keep making money and not getting to the business of warfare. Like, we'll have to wait the Netherlands against the French invasion of Louis XIV to see finally a system that is in fact, as we were saying before, the most efficient in terms of cost benefits in the entire history of warfare. And that explains to you also what we're talking about. Europe now is still very fragmented. Yes, some greater powers are forming, but still they don't put so much pressure, after all, at the point of needing to unite, to stress this cohesion, to develop more robust centralized structures that can even confer this discipline to the troops at the point they can be really, really effective. The first start with that are the Swiss, even if the French, the Burgundians, and the Venetians especially showed a pretty damn good sophisticated way of coping with that reality that medieval warfare was at the time. Right? Once again, there's not a teleological reason to push forward if there's not enough pressure, because there is a political and social cost to that, right? But regarding artillery, that's very important because, as we were saying before, the Flanders were some of the richest and the most technologically advanced areas of Europe at the time, together with France, with Italy, and they were producing pretty good artillery. They had the manufacturers, their skills, the material, right? The Netherlands, as such, will keep exporting artillery to poorer, less advanced countries like England, for example, especially during the Renaissance times. Like, this was a very florid area that kept, as we know, maintaining its autonomies after all. And what is fascinating is also that actually the lowlands are conquered exactly in the centuries by the Burgundians, right? The Burgundians managed to defeat the Flemish and to assert substantial control on their communities. And as we've seen in videos on the Burgundian army, the Flemish militias were integral part of the Burgundian military. And the Burgundian military was, as you know, more centralized. As we've just said, it reached some of the peaks of military sophistication, especially with Charles the Bold, but also before his predecessors. And one characteristic was that Burgundy objectively developed. There was a time in the mid-15th century in which objectively Burgundy had the largest amount of artillery in Europe. Right, it lasted a few, because eventually when the French win the 100 Years' War, they immediately start expanding and investing there. But it was this time in which the brothers, the Burgundians, because they were essentially the same Valois dynasty that ruled the French, just another France, just another branch there, having the most precocious and better organized park of artillery. And most of this artillery didn't come from Burgundy. There was a largely feudal country. It came from, with a more traditional and more, less technologically oriented military culture, but from the lowlands. Like, all these workshops and foundries that were there could produce these pieces that, however, even in there weren't eventually much standardized. Like, especially when you look at the Flemish armies fighting on their own. So when they weren't directed by anyone, with other resources, invested in those armies, you see that they used typically lots of small guns, right? So as it was typical at the time, there's still no central state, no standardization. Hence, the best thing you can do actually is putting together all these smaller guns that are produced by the individual cities. Actually, even for when they quarreled with each other, the feudal lords, because warfare continued at all times, even within Flanders in many ways. And that was what a non-central state could field on a regular basis. But still, Flanders on average fielded a lot of firepower. And seemingly they even knew how to use it. And one of the reasons why this is the case is that, once again, that sort of commoner laziness, right? That says, okay, I have these guns. Why don't I invest a bit more in them instead of, putting, of training archers, right? Of people in my community that don't care about that. They just want to do their craft and that's it, right? So, and actually, some of the greatest successes, let's say, in the series of defeats of the Flemish in this regard, have to do with the employ of their handguns that sometimes could even bog down the advance of the French men-at-arms, as it happened, and of the Burgundians. And this is this speaks, at least for a technical advancement, it kind of fits with what Villani was saying before about the Flemish militias. They were also well armored, because even Villani in the same Florence was pretty damn similar in this regard to as a city-state in that kind of level of wealth, could afford all this armor, even for city revolts in which citizens were said to have as much armor as knights did, right? And you can't find outside of places like Flanders or Italy something like that in the rest of Europe, because, once again, politics and societies are very different. And also this reference to the relative vulnerability of the phalanx to projectiles, right? In turn, the Burgundians will make an effective use of bowmen against the Flemish phalanx, right? Very thick. Well, it's a pretty damn good target for the bowmen. And given that the cohesion, as we have seen, of these phalanxes is not very high, especially if you tempest them with these projectiles before the attack, well, you know that you're softening their ranks up pretty well. So that was a problem, right? And especially, since the phalanx has this defensive character, you can exploit it, right? How long are you willing to wait under fire before dislodging from a advantageous defensive position, right? But sometimes, as we will see, the same Flemish abandoned their defensive position, getting even more hardly pounded by crossbow or longbow fire when they were caught in the open, right? So sometimes even they managed to repulse enemy cavalry, but then they were essentially hit heavily by missile fire, and eventually reserves could dispense them. They could defeat them. The same phalanx, as we've seen, was usually supported by crossbowmen and archers that were positioned on the flanks and or skirmished ahead of the phalanx, withdrawing back to the main body in the face of an enemy charge. It was really typical. And generally speaking, pikemen were ineffective against larger numbers of archers and artillery, as the Burgundians proved in their wars against Ghent, specifically in 1452, 1453. Yet, as we have seen, for cavalry to charge into this massed pikes without previous softening up, or just for the fact of charging them frontally, well, we wasn't very willing to do it, and therefore a flanking maneuver, an attack on the rear, if possible, was preferred. So I would very briefly pass to to the major battles of the time that I think are much more eloquent, as we've seen. So I think we have discussed extensively Courtrai for today. I mean, very concisely actually, but for what we can talk about in here. So Courtrai, this big charge of French cavalry that was substantially disordered by crossing the stream in front of the enemy formation, but still reforming, regrouping, and charging effectively against Flemish infantry. This great absorption of the cavalry charge from the side of the lowlanders that leads to just no more than a few hundred losses from their side, and 63 nobles, including some of the flower French nobility, and at least other 700 knights, or possibly up even to 1,000 fallen from the French side. And the golden spores of the dead knights were hung up in the churches of Courtrai. Right? Remember here that the people is also pretty damn ferocious. As we were saying before, the knights are tending to ransom each other if they catch each other prisoner. The people, the commoners, do not do that. The commoners' military culture is characterized by pretty damn offensive weapons. The crossbow becomes the symbol of it. The crossbow hits everybody, doesn't look if you're a nobleman or not, and it does kill. So here there is a great deal also in the change of military mindset. Right, it's not really true that knights preferred just to take each other's prisoner. Right, if you think that it was this kind of elegant way of warfare in which knights, because it's stupid to kill someone if you can ransom him, as if that was a regular standard. Knights massacred each other regularly, for that matter. It's simply that were other situations in which it was better for a commoner. Commoners ransomed knights as well, but the idea is that there is inherently a greater clash, usually when commoners fight against knights, which is difficult to find after all, because Courtrai could even be an exception in the sense that even if there were these professional knights that ordered the line and commanded the troops, but at the same time it was also a matter of chiefly commoners really taking up arms, right? But in all this context, in a way or another, was still commoners led by noblemen or sided by noblemen, right? So it's difficult to find really a sharp cut between feudal cavalry versus commoners. At the same time, the commoner tends to see the nobleman as an enemy beyond the strictly was the polity that is using it. Like it's also a social problem. Sometimes in medieval warfare you see that even within the same armies, noblemen abandon commoners to their destiny in battle, vice versa, right? Very interesting is the Battle of Montpenvel, fought in 1304, which you had essentially these army of 12 to 15,000 lowlanders fighting against the army of, nonetheless, King Philip the Fair, right? That comprised 3,000 cavalry plus a large force of infantrymen plus a sound body of crossbowmen, right? The battle began with the crossbow fire, and the interesting aspect of it more than else is that the French tried to essentially flank the lowlanders, right? As we've seen, this phalanx was drawn chiefly with one direction towards the enemy, and the flank in the rear was pretty weak. And there was very hard fought engagement. Like the French kept attacking also on the flank. They used even artillery, but the point here is that the battle was resolved because at one point the French were exhausted and they had dismounted, were resting. The two armies were negotiating, and the army, of Ypres and Ghent, that were the main cities here, involved, advanced towards the French. And the interesting aspect of it is that that is effectively what made the French flee, and in which the king almost was killed for, because they didn't expect the situation. So that's a pretty good example of how battles also can be won aside from standard tactics. Because what are standard tactics anyway? There's never something like that. And however, the Flemish haven't considered in here that they don't have cavalry, so the French can't flee. But what they do, they regroup and they attack once again the lowlanders that now are in part ravaging the French camp, but another one is surrounded and actually butchered down to the last. And there was, there was also here who won, who lost, because this was a battle in which everybody claimed victory, but it was probably a costly draw. To explain it better, the Battle of Cassel. 16,000 lowland rebels, right, against Philip VI of France. Cassel, 1328, by the way. And the French now are clever because they make this concentration maneuver. They manage to envelop the lowlanders and to surround them. And as we were seeing before, the Flemish drew up in this Schiltrom formation, but they start suffering heavy defeats. But so the French, in part, so the French leave a gap for the Flemish, to the lowlanders to flee, and they escape from there, and obviously they get butchered down, right? So that's also another way to say that not always the same tactics actually have meaning, depending on what the moral forces are involved here. Making this other jump, the Battle of Rosebecke as well, it is pretty interesting. 1382, in which we have a Flemish army of 50,000 men, as we've seen before under Philip van Artevelde. And from the other side, the French army under King Charles VI, right? And basically the rebels at this point are in this solid defensive position behind a ditch and a barricade of bushes, right? In this large battle. However, at some point, the Flemish army decides to set forth to advance, to gain position on a hill between them and the French, so they could have this advantage of the high ground. But the French spot them with their explorers, and basically they outmarch them, and they catch the Flemish in the open. And so this was a tough, first of all, the French advanced with dismounted men-at-arms in the center and cavalry on either flanks. And what is fascinating here is artillery employment, right? In the earlier 14th century, there isn't much of it to be seen. Now the Flemish have a consistent one that manages to actually pin down the French center, inflicting considerable losses through their artillery. But the French cavalry wings charge and basically envelop the Flemish flanks. And this is fascinating because whatever the thing happened, the Flemish pikemen in the center basically either do not deploy correctly or simply they're overwhelmed. They start fleeing, and the French cavalry is crashing into them, and the Flemish troops pile each other up, and they suffocate in the crush. And the French center, by the way, had rallied and also succeeded in closing, and the Flemish suffered this great defeat, great losses, slain by heaps one upon another, just after 30 minutes of fighting, right? This total rout. And this is very, very important because it's a major, 50,000 men, even assuming it is true, right, adding up all the various contingents, but it's the maximum of the logistical capabilities of men you can tactically control from the field in a battle at a time, right? You can't. So think about the disorder here. Here there are many. Probably they're even overconfident because they have courage to spend to abandon their fortified position, but they have no cohesion. They simply crumble under French cavalry charge, and even if they're infantry and so many, there's nothing they can do here. It's even a disadvantage. And Charles VI here even ordered the city of Courtrai, the town of Courtrai, to be burned down in revenge for the French defeat 80 years earlier, right? Rosenbeck is pretty brutal battle after all. Then we have the Battle of Autey, or also known as Tongres, in 1408. Here are the wars against Burgundy, and you find another army of Liège of allegedly 50,000 men, right? And with some smaller numbers of men at arms, a few hundreds, or even a tiny bit of English archers in Liégeois pay. The Burgundian army is better balanced and smaller, but more effective in this regard. It has 1,300 men at arms, 1,500 crossbowmen and archers, plus 5 bombards, plus other 1,200 men at arms and 2 other crossbowmen from another detachment. So what happens in this battle is that the Burgundians sat on the high ground because they realize they are outnumbered by the Liégeois, and they're actually pretty close to the enemy. They're separated just by a narrow valley with a drainage ditch at the bottom, and the Dukes of Burgundy deploy in a single mass with wings and of archers and men at arms. That is basically what would be the standard tactic at that point. If you look at the English armies, it's how they effectively deployed. The history of the hearse with all the tiny, triangles of archers in front of men at arms is not really correct. The hearse is actually the wings of the English archers that create this enfilade fire from in front of the enemy of their own center of men at arms, right? Which is a much more simple and effective deployment than other imaginary ones, by the way. And even in here, the Liégeois open the engagement with artillery fire, meaning that showing that that the lowland armies were pretty good at firepower, as seemingly, as Monstrelet says, the Liégeois played off many cannons against their enemies, which annoyed them very much. And at this point, the Burgundians dispatched 500 mounted men at arms and 1,000 infantry to attack the Liégeois rear once again. Here, the same weakness of the previous lowland armies, while the rest of the Burgundian army attacked the enemy on foot from the front. The Liégeois here employ an interesting formation. There is a square, but with triangle, a sort of wedge formation in the front, right? And with the other troop crossbowmen and archers on the flanks, and baggage and horses in the rear, right? And the battle went on for 2 hours, basically, when the Burgundian detachment fell on the Liégeois rear, and which brought, albeit hampered by the wagons, to cut off and destroy some 6,000 Liégeois who were attempting to flee the field. And even in here, this massive army of 50,000 men is virtually destroyed, right? Losses raging, wildly here in number of thousands, and even detachment of 2,000 men coming from Tongres in support of the Liégeois was cut up by the Duke's cavalry detachment. So massive defeat. These are inappealable defeats of the Flemish model at this point, of the lowland models, because it's not really a matter of, this formula has not changed. It does the same thing, and it's defeated by smaller armies regularly who have another type of, organization that is based on more contained numbers, but more flexibility and combined tactics. So we're talking about massive numbers, especially, that get wiped out. That this naturally speaks also for the resilience of the systems from a socio-economical point of view. But I mean, it's still impressive how they eventually would lose for their same independence, right? Looking at the wars with Burgundy now, 1452-53, we were talking about before, Rupelmonde of 1452. It's Ghent that is defending from the army of Philip the Good of Burgundy, which advances towards the town of Rupelmonde, which the Gentois had fortified with earthworks and artillery. And at this point, the Flemings do not come out of their entrenchments, right? So the Duke of Burgundy sends forward just a small proportion of his force to skirmish and draw them into the open. And at the same time, he also draws up the rest of his army in close order, so that their true numbers were concealed. So what the Gantois do is that they emerge from their entrenchments, once again abandon an advantageous defensive position to attack the Burgundian advance guard, which immediately wheels round and flees. So also in here, it's pretty well concerted action that throws the Ghent pike phalanx into the very arms of the main Burgundian army. And then there is this wild fight that ensues. And even in here, Ghent shows once again the effectiveness of the lowlanders' handguns that are inflict losses to the enemy, but eventually they can't resist to the withering fire of the actually the Picard archers at the service of the Burgundians, and they leave 2,500 dead behind them, and they broke and fled to safety of other entrenchments that they had thrown up around the nearby village of Acre. Other defeat substantially caused by the same patterns, like this massive man abandons, without a good reason, an advantageous position, shows some firepower, but eventually is overwhelmed. The Battle of Gavere of 1453. Once again, Philip of Burgundy against the rebels of Ghent, right? And the Burgundians are now to cope with the usual great phalanx of the Gantois, with large numbers of handgunners and artillery brought to the fore. So this is very meaningful, because it seems as if the Flemings wanted to, to shower the enemy with, fire before engaging them. So always this idea, okay, let's give out the best we have so that we can eventually absorb less, hopefully less, a disrupted enemy. But it's kind of a desperate situation, because at this point the handgunners and artillery are not able to stop an entire army, right? At Rosebecca, yeah, they stopped the French center for a while, but these arms are not yet decisive in a European warfare. Probably their importance is surely growing, like we know it at this point, but still, right? What the Burgundians do is that once again they do something similar done at Rupelmonde. That is, they send this vanguard in the front, and then they retreat. And so the Gantois mistake this action for a flight, and they charge forward in a mass. And they also they surpass their own artillery. Right, so once again, bad mistake. You had played all on this array for artillery in the front. You don't even exploit its potential because you get past it, right? And at this point, the Gantois are met with heavy arrow fire, and they are attacked by this concentrated charge of 3 divisions of the Burgundian army at once, which broke them out, right? So, once again, same thing. At this point, just one body of 1,400, 1,500 Gantois pikemen rally, and in a field on 3 sides surrounded by ditches, and on the fort by the Skeld River. And at least these troops, this is kind of usually during retreats, there is always someone who resists to the end, right, in one point, also to allow the others to flee. And at this point, they manage in part to repulse every fort of the Burgundian cavalry to cross the ditches. So this shows what it should be like, right, defending in an advantageous position. Now they don't have artillery anymore, but still it's better ground for defending, which you should have done all along, right? Cavalry doesn't make it to break. So, however, what the Burgundians do is that since they are resourceful, tactically speaking, they diversify their troops. They use archers and men-at-arms, including the Duke Philip himself, with his son, the future Charles the Bold, by the way, and essentially assaulting the ditch. And at this point, every Gantois in the field is either killed or drowned in the Skeld. So basically, how do you cope? Well, you see here the Burgundian army has all the tactical means, right, tactical options at its disposal to cope with the situation, while the Flemish have basically just a mono-arm army, right? Because the artillery still is somewhat not considerable as a determinant, like a, at least decisive thing. So the pikemen now are effective against cavalry, but not against the combination of infantry plus bowmen that managed to storm this heavily defended position and massacre the pikemen that individually are not meant to fight, right? Well, the men-at-arms are, because they are the best professionals to do that, and therefore at close range they manage to get into the pikes, by the way, to defeat the Flemings. This is very important, by the way, because it still shows, after all, that even if these are 1,400, 1,500 pikemen, it's still too few to stem a substantial amount of men-at-arms, right? And before armies of pikemen now would develop, you have to wait the contemporary developments of the Swiss, but in previous times that had already learned their lesson at Arbedo in 1422, where it effectively was the Milanese knights that dismounted and defeated the Swiss halberdiers, that is very different from pikemen, with their own cavalry lances that were longer than theirs, right? And from there the Swiss that had pikes as well, but decided that they have to keep the whole army with pikes, and that's how the thing was born, right? But just, we can't think that now the Flemish had fully standardized their army either with just pikemen, and even if they did, however, the Burgundian men-at-arms plus bowmen were enough to defeat them. And Monstrelet, that is partisan, claims 20,000 losses from the side of Ghent at Gabert, while the Burgundians' losses would have been just 16 dead. It's exaggerated, but it still gives the idea of what this irreparable disasters of concentrated masses of pikemen could be like, effectively. Right here, the main problem is lack of flexibility, especially of counter-attacking measures. Even the absence of reserves is striking, right? There's yet this other defeat at Brustham in 1467. This is once again the Liégeois that are besieged Saint-Tron by the Burgundians under Charles the Bold. And another force of relief of 30,000 men from Liège, that is entirely infantry with the exception of 500 cavalrymen, but also strongly supported by artillery, right? So Charles the Bold abandons the siege and he draws his army in front of the fortified village of Brustham, where the Liégeois army had entrenched itself with its artillery. Also very interesting because technically the Liégeois are on the strategic offensive, but when the Burgundians march against them, they're less than them even. They defend tactically. So this already speaks for the mindset of these armies. We're still regularly on the defensive from a tactical point of view. And Charles deploys his center of archers and dismounted men-at-arms with a reserve of 800 lances in the rear and 1,200 more lances on either flank, right? And his vanguard, entirely on foot, as we've seen, and supported by some guns, attacks the Liégeois entrenchments and even captures their artillery in the action. However, there is this determined counterattack by the Liégeois pikemen that kills some 400 or 500 Burgundians. This is interesting because it's pikemen on the offensive and being successful. But, once again, these pikemen are repulsed by the Burgundian archers reserve that intervene now. So just archers at this point, even for the losses they caused with missile fire, managed to break this counterattack. So it's as if the bowmen were decisive, right, in the engagement, the smaller engagement. So at this point the Liégeois break en route, right? They flee. Initially the Burgundians have a problem because their cavalry can't pursue them on the marshes, but anyhow, more than 6,000 Liégeois died in the battle, right? And Comines even observes that this figure would have been as high as 15,000 had not nightfall cut short the Burgundian pursuit, right? And still, only Burgundian infantry was able to chase them. So just think even in here what it means. That this even can speak for the relative weight of also the army itself. I mean, and these are high losses. I mean, losing 6,000 men is 1 out of 5 of an army of 30,000 men. That is to entrench itself, and even if when it counterattacks, he's effectively routed by archer fire. So do you realize here there is something going wrong? From the exploit of Courtrai, there were many other battles. Now we don't count them all, but these were some of the major ones. You realize that there is not a real systematic strengthening of lowland armies. Here they kept relying substantially on the same tactics, even in the face of repeated defeats, with just some improvement in firepower that, however, wasn't not nearly decisive. So it's a serious problem. And that's where we get, in conclusion, I think it's very educational in this regard, to the Battle of Guinegat, the first one in 1479, in the struggle between Louis XI of France and Maximilian of Habsburg, Duke of Austria, for the control of the Burgundian possessions. That shows how, at this point, basically the lowlands had annexed, at least dynastically, by the Habsburgs, and that's how the story. Maximilian had inherited this land from his marriage to Charles the Bold's daughter Mary, famously Mary of Burgundy. It's interesting. So 1479 here, the Swiss model is already around, and Maximilian has the several. Among his commanders, such as Jacques de Savoie, but also the Count of the Romande, that was from Neuchâtel and had trained the Flemish militias the lowland militias fighting here in this battle, 20,000 men under Maximilian, in the Swiss fashion, right? Because he was Swiss himself. And now Maximilian was pretty much involved into trying to replicate the Swiss model. He was a fan of foot combat. In many ways, he who started this idea that even noblemen could fight on foot, and now war was changing towards something different. And he created the Landsknecht as such, as a replica of the Swiss, and that's starting this trend in a situation that here is not properly reckoned, because the lowlands now were not very happy to have fallen under the Habsburgs. Like, they were not happy to be under anyone. They just wanted to be free. And for Maximilian, it would be quite difficult to start this military reform of the Flemish army. In fact, it would fail, right? But still, at Guinegat, this Flemish infantry trained at the Swiss way, right, proved to be finally effective, right? Eventually, the thing failed because it was improbable to essentially from Austria to control the Netherlands as, this center, highly trained militia under the Habsburg control, right? So that's also why the Landsknecht developed in a different way, also with people that largely were recruited not very far away from there, but from a different political and social background, right? In this army, there were also some Germans and 300 Englishmen. And Maximilian was besieging Terouanne with this army. And the French army advanced in here. We're talking about 11 to 1,200 lances of the ordnance companies, plus 80,000 franc archers, right? So the French, after starting from the 100 Years' War, began to have also their own archers. And Maximilian raised the siege and advanced to meet the French. So the main problem here is that it's always the same formula. So tens of thousands of lowland militiamen. Maximilian doesn't have nearly as many men at arms as the cavalry, right? As the French. And therefore he dismounts as many, also to give an example, to combat on foot in the first line, right? And he manages actually to achieve a lot, because his cavalry was actually defeated by the French with great slaughter and loss of baggage, but Maximilian, at the head of the Flemish infantry trained in the Swiss model, let's say, manages to advance, to attack, to storm French artillery, and to defeat actually the Franc archers that had been set to loot the baggage, right, and slaughtering also the great part of them, right. So it was. Sometimes this is depicted as a great victory, but it was effectively, stalemate in some ways, because the losses were very high from both sides, as 15,000 men, right? Of which from 11 to 12 were Burgundians. So actually, the loss here was I mean, Burgundians meant as, now the Netherlands being the Burgundian legacy of the inheritance of the Habsburgs, right? Because they had belonged to the Burgundians. So we're talking about very heavy losses. I mean, more than half of the 20,000 lowlanders at Maximilian's service. So a bath of blood. So it's something that seemingly still reflects the massive losses that could happen, when these major masses of militiamen were defeated in these encounters. The French were also said to have made something like 900 or 1,000 prisoners. So yeah, Guinegat, let's put it among the victories, but it was still a bath of blood, and still this militia wasn't so exceptional. But basically, they were infantrymen that managed to defeat chiefly archers, right? But still proving there that they could hold their ground, which now, and I still have to look in detail the sources because I don't know the battle well, but this still speaks, in practice, it's seen as the prodrome of what also future tactical developments would be about, because all the other European powers were to copy essentially the Swiss model. And in this sense, the lowlanders under the Habsburgs, though, have to be given credit for having been basically the first, because not even the Burgundians had done it before, nor the Italians, definitely not the French, that were actually employing the Swiss themselves, the Reichsläufer. And still we have to give credit, especially to Maximilian of Habsburg, that now, however, is effectively a dynasty, a prince, and of course Holy Roman Emperor, which is somewhat jarring, because if you take it from Courtrai, that these were just commoners, right, freely going to fight against the feudal elite. Now you find that the last success of the Middle Ages, and the last very few success of the Flemish here, is due to the intervention of the very feudal elite, right, that albeit recognizing the modernizing of contemporary warfare, is basically imposing a discipline and a control on these militias in order to render them effective, which is a very different thing from which the spirit of the early 14th century had been about. And more in general also, like as we've seen, the Netherlands would go on their own way, right? Habsburgs or not, they will manage even to secede, but later on. But still, it's quite meaningful to observe essentially a situation that in basically at the birth of modernity, of modern warfare, had actually killed the 14th century infantry revival. That's paradoxical, right? Here, infantry is taking over again, but it's a very different model of infantry from the first one. It's a professional model framed under the rigid, statalist, feudal, if you want, it's a bit contrast, but yeah, it was statalist, still largely feudal, a military culture that is going to be the one that will develop, in fact, the modern armies as we know it. They're not anymore armies of people, but are armies of state and dynasty, right? Which is a very, very different thing. And so what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that you should never look at popular military culture as the answer, because the best answer is always professionalism, right? You can't have citizen soldiers, but you need a hierarchy that leads them, that frames them, that disciplines them, that trains them, that keeps them, right? You can't think that the achievement of infantry is an abstract tactical arm that doesn't come from, from a political social context, and you just talk about infantry, or even presuming that this was all about, new types of weapons that, changed the game. No. Absolutely, basically not. Like, if anything, new weapons were developed to support these tactics, but not, they didn't made them. So let's be serious about medieval warfare, and let's stop with this wargamistic obsession towards the idea that there is a weapon that makes the difference. Please. Please. I know that half of medieval warfare in popular culture has been explained through war games, reenactment and things, but you can't focus on literally the least important aspects of warfare to understand warfare. Right? It's not a technologistic, it's not a mechanicistic, it's not a positivistic business. Especially in these times where, first of all, it's never like that in all warfare. But especially in those times, if you want to pretend to be aware of medieval warfare, you have to realize that largely this was an homogeneous system. So that even we're talking about, focusing so much on differences is to completely miss great part of the deal of this whole game, let's say, because actually what's happening in Flanders is what happens largely in all the main, almost all the other centers that have still this general orientation, right, of cities and, feudal powers, that all scattered without still a central solid state. You can find good infantries, good cavalries, etc., but on the field it's now really another political and social model that is going to make the difference, and you have to understand where those troops come from. So aside from this, it's interesting to look at these stories. We will talk more in detail about the single battles we've discussed today. We will make a video for each of them, and also we'll try to be a bit more detailed about this this chapter, because there is not much of lowland history here discussed, and I think we are missing a very interesting and important point of medieval warfare that everybody, just all of a sudden, 14th, 15th century, only the 100 Years' War exists, and all what matters, it revolves around the weapons of the 100 Years' War, that specific context, and nothing else, right? And if you really want to understand the Middle Ages, you have to understand them all, right? You can't start from the point that it's just your country that matters. If you don't understand all the countries, at least in Europe or even beyond, in the Mediterranean, the Near East, just to remain closer, you effectively will lack an irreparable amount of awareness and depth and perspective, and you can't look at that period through such lenses. Alright, so let's stop here and just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.